The New Deal was a series of social liberal programs enacted in the United States between 1933 and 1938, and a few that came later. They included both laws passed by Congress as well as presidential executive orders during the first term of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The programs were in response to the Great Depression and focused on what historians refer to as the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery of the economy to normal levels, and reform of the financial system to prevent a repeat depression. The New Deal produced a political realignment, making the Democratic Party the majority, with its base in liberal ideas, the South, traditional Democrats, big city machines, and the newly empowered labor unions and ethnic minorities. The Republicans were split, with conservatives opposing the entire New Deal as an enemy of business and growth, and liberals accepting some of it and promising to make it more efficient. The realignment crystallized into the New Deal coalition that dominated most presidential elections into the 1960s, while the opposing conservative coalition largely controlled Congress from 1939 to 1964. By 1936, the term liberal typically was used for supporters of the New Deal, and conservative for its opponents. From 1934 to 1938, Roosevelt was assisted in his endeavors by a pro-spender majority in Congress, as noted by Alexander Hicks. Roosevelt, backed by rare, non-Southern Democrat majorities, 270 non-Southern Democrat representatives and 71 non-Southern Democrat senators, spelled Second New Deal reform. Quote, in the 1938 midterm elections, however, Roosevelt and his liberal supporters lost control of Congress to the bipartisan conservative coalition. Many historians distinguish between their first New Deal and a second New Deal, with the second one more liberal and more controversial. The first New Deal dealt with the pressing banking crises through the Emergency Banking Act and the 1933 Banking Act. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided $500 million for relief operations by states and cities, while the short-lived Civil Works Administration gave localities money to operate make-work projects in 1933-34. The Securities Act of 1933 was enacted to prevent a repeated stock market crash. The controversial work of the National Recovery Administration was also part of the first New Deal. The Second New Deal, in 1935-38, included the Wagner Act to promote labor unions, the Works Progress Administration Relief Program, the Social Security Act, and new programs to aid tenant farmers and migrant workers. The final major items of New Deal legislation were the creation of the United States Housing Authority and Farm Security Administration, both in 1937, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which set maximum hours and minimum wages for most categories of workers. The economic downturn of 1937-38, and the bitter split between the AFL and CIO labor unions led to major Republican gains in Congress in 1938. Conservative Republicans and Democrats in Congress joined in the informal conservative coalition. By 1942-43, they shut down relief programs such as the WPNCCC and blocked major liberal proposals. Roosevelt himself turned his attention to the war effort, and won re-election in 1940 and 1944. The Supreme Court declared the National Recovery Administration and the first version of the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. However, the AAA was rewritten and then upheld. As the first Republican president elected after FDR, Dwight D. Eisenhower left the New Deal largely intact, even expanding it in some areas. In the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society used the New Deal as inspiration for a dramatic expansion of liberal programs, which Republican Richard M. Nixon generally retained. After 1974, however, the call for deregulation of the economy gained bipartisan support. The New Deal regulation of banking was suspended in the 1990s. Many New Deal programs remain active, with some still operating under the original names, including the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. The largest programs still in existence today are the Social Security System and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Origins: economic collapse from 1929 to 1933. Manufacturing output decreased by 1/3. Prices fell by 20%, causing deflation that made repaying debts much harder. Unemployment in the U.S. increased from 4% to 25%. Additionally, 1/3 of all employed persons were downgraded to working part-time on much smaller paychecks. In the aggregate, almost 50% of the nation's human work power was going unused. Before the New Deal, there was no insurance on deposits at banks. When thousands of banks closed, depositors lost their savings. At the time, there was no national safety net, no public unemployment insurance, and no Social Security. Relief for the poor was the responsibility of families, private charity, and local governments. But as conditions worsened year by year, demand skyrocketed and their combined resources increasingly fell far short of demand. The Depression had devastated the nation. As Roosevelt took the oath of office at noon on March 4, 1933, all state governors had authorized bank holidays or restricted withdrawals. Many Americans had little or no access to the bank accounts. The unemployment rate was about 25% and higher in major industrial and mining centers. Farm income had fallen by over 50% since 1929. 844,000 non-farm mortgages had been foreclosed 1930 to 33, out of 5 million in all. Political and business leaders feared revolution and anarchy. Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr., who remained wealthy during the Depression, stated years later that, "In those days I felt and said I would be willing to part with half of what I had if I could be sure of keeping, under law and order, the other half." New Deal. Upon accepting the 1932 Democratic nomination for president, Franklin Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the American people. Roosevelt entered office without a specific set of plans for dealing with the Great Depression, so he improvised as Congress listened to a very wide variety of voices. Among Roosevelt's more famous advisers was an informal brain trust, a group that tended to view pragmatic government intervention in the economy positively. His choice for Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, greatly influenced his initiatives. Her list of what her priorities would be if she took the job illustrates: a 40-hour workweek, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service and health insurance. The New Deal policies drew from many different ideas proposed earlier in the 20th century. Assistant Attorney General Thurman Arnold led efforts that harkened back to an anti-monopoly tradition rooted in American politics by figures such as Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, an influential advisor to many New Dealers, argued that bigness was a negative economic force, producing waste and inefficiency. However, the anti-monopoly group never had a major impact on New Deal policy. Other leaders such as Hugh S. Johnson of the NRA took ideas from the Woodrow Wilson administration, advocating techniques used to mobilize the economy for World War I. They brought ideas and experience from the government controls and spending of 1917–18. Other New Deal planners revived experiments suggested in the 1920s, such as the TVA. The first New Deal encompassed the proposals offered by a wide spectrum of groups. This first phase of the New Deal was also characterized by fiscal conservatism and experimentation with several different, sometimes contradictory, cures for economic ills. The consequences were uneven. Some programs, especially the National Recovery Administration and the Silver Program, have been widely seen as failures. Other programs lasted about a decade. Some became permanent. The economy shot upward, with FDR's first term marking one of the fastest periods of GDP growth in history. Though a downturn in 1937–38 raised questions about just how successful the policies were. The great majority of economists and historians agree that they were an overall benefit. The New Deal faced some vocal conservative opposition. The first organized opposition in 1934 came from the American Liberty League, led by conservative Democrats such as 1924 and 1928 presidential candidates John W. Davis and Al Smith. There was also a large but loosely affiliated group of New Deal opponents, who are commonly called the Old Right. This group included politicians, intellectuals, writers, and newspaper editors of various philosophical persuasions, including classical liberals and conservatives, both Democrats and Republicans. A number of leading Democrats, who were progressives of the Woodrow Wilson era, were also critical of Roosevelt's New Deal policies. According to James T. Patterson, these leaders were essentially progressives of the New Freedom vintage. They continued to believe that the party stood for Wilsonian ideals, regulated competition, states' rights, and individual freedom where it did not impinge upon the liberty of others, and saw themselves as the true progressives and as the bulwarks of a party which they felt would have collapsed without them in the 1920s. The New Deal represented a significant shift in politics and domestic policy. It especially led to greatly increased federal regulation of the economy. It also marked the beginning of complex social programs and growing power of labor unions. The effects of the New Deal remain a source of controversy and debate among economists and historians.